Old Tom Gray here made me a vice grip bar clamp out of a cheap pair of vice grips, a short piece of rectangular tubing, a short piece of ready bolt, and a scrap of 16 gauge. I'll show you how I did it. Alright, let's get started. This is one of a set of 4 of these clamps that I bought for like 30 bucks. They were in a blister pack, so it's kind of cheap, but it'll do for what we're doing here. The spine of the clamp is going to be this piece of, I think it's 1/2 by 1 square tubing that I have laying around. The sliding member, or the movable jaw, is going to be based on this piece, which roughly telescopes over the smaller tube with a little bit of slop, but that's okay. And then a hunk of ready bolt, a nut, and maybe this connector nut, I'm not sure. For temporary purposes, I'm just going to use some friction tape to temporarily mount the ready bolt. So I can see if this is going to work. That will hold the ready bolt in the right orientation to the tube. It kind of centers it naturally, just the tension on the tape. Now I've got to split this nut down the middle. Right, so here's our little half nut, and it engages freely and disengages freely off of the ready bolt. Here's a simulation of the mechanics of it. So I just hot glued this half nut onto this piece of junk 16 gauge that has a hole in it, and so I'm going to use this welding rod to simulate the fulcrum, and when this is swung down, you can see the half nut engages the tube, or the ready bolt. And then when it's swung up, it disengages. You can easily slide it and then relock it, and then slide it and relock it. So the movable jaw's got to go on this side so that it can create force that way. That will then crank the half nut hard onto the ready bolt. Pivot around that point. So I need the movable jaw's got to be about yay long and kind of triangular, sort of shaped, tubular, triangular kind of thing. Change of plans. I don't like how small that nut is. I'm not going to be able to get a good weld on that. So I changed plans. I'm going to use the connector nut, and I'll split that, and instead of using this piece of tubing, I'll bend something up out of this piece of off-cut 16 gauge. Now I'm going to cut a piece of this plate off, this 16 gauge off. That's about as wide as what I need for my mechanics proof, plus enough to wrap around the spine. Now I'm going to split the nut, at least try. So here's the piece of offcut. This is the 1/2 inch space I need for the spine. Just fold that up in the old break here. Very extreme close up here, and I just laid a 1/4 inch 20 nut on the table, and then I cammed the movable jaw down so that the front is hitting the table and the back is sitting on the nut, and then I pushed the split 1/2 nut into the movable jaw and clamped it in place. So in service, get rid of that. This is your clamped position, threads engaged. This is your clamped position, threads engaged. And this is your unclamped position. And it moves very nice and smoothly. And then when I go to reclamp it, threads bite. I'm pulling on there, right down here where my thumb is. Threads engaged. Good grip, nice and strong. Okay. Before I start tacking, I'm just gonna create a very slight flat spot on the ready bolt. That's the part that's gonna sit against the spine. So I'm just gonna take a flat file and just knock a little bit off of those threads. I replaced the friction tape with my high-tech weld fixturing tape, also known as masking tape, and I spaced the ready bolt a couple inches away from the ends of the spinal tube because I need that to engage to the frame of the vice grip. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to do that yet. Using 35 thousandths wire and 100% CO2. Mostly because I'm too lazy to change to a smaller wire, but this is just to get tacked, so. Okay, redoing our bench simulation for real this time. So in goes the 1/2 nut, my 1/4 20 nut spacer, push that down on the threads, clamp it in place, remove the spacer, she works good. Yep. Okay. And the movable jaw is that way. Okay. Looks righteous. It's now time to figure out how to mount the spine to the frame of the vice grip. So first thing I'm going to do is knock out this rivet and extract the fixed jaw. I'm setting the frame, the top of the frame, at 90 degrees to the edge of my bench. And then I'm going to put the jaw back in so the pinhole lines and the jaws just touch. And I'm going to measure the angle of the jaw relative to the edge of the bench. That's that angle right there. So that's what we're going to mimic on the movable jaw of our clamp. For mounting, I think I'm going to make a spline that goes between the clamp body, the clamp frame, and the spine. I'm going to make a spline that fits in the spine, or a splint if you like, and goes into the clamp frame. And a 1/4 inch doesn't quite fit in there, and is a little too thin for there. But if I shim this with a couple pieces of 18 gauge, it fits just righteous. So I can make that up to shim in there with some 18 gauge and a couple of plug welds. And then on this, I can grind this out and grind this down so that I can get a nice splint mounted in here and plug weld it to that hole. Splint and shims. Here's the spline fitted inside the frame and the spine of the clamp. Looks like I'm going to need this ready bolt right down on top of the frame, so I'm going to lop that off, and then I should be able to drill it for plug welds, put the shims in, and tack everything together. With this clamp down to the workmate weld table, I'm going to square this up. And I'm just going to tack the frame to the splint. I'm going to drill through the spacers, which I have stacked on here, all the way through the spine for the plug weld holes. The spacer's in there, and the splint is in there. I'm just going to align this, tighten it up. Square it, and then tack through. Instead of lopping off the tube for the spine, I cut the ready bolt loose. I'm going to slide it down and re-weld it in position just to save a couple inches of tube. I know that next time I go to use this tube, I'm going to be, an inch short, and so I don't want to waste the material. So I'm going to tack this back on. I'm going to weld this first, bevel this, and then re-tack it. To locate the upper jaw, I'm going to install the movable jaw sleeve, reset my angle that I marked out before, and then set the spacing of the two jaws so they're in line. And I'm going to draw a cut line right there. So I'm going to cut the movable jaw right there. Now what I'm doing here is I'm sliding the movable jaw up and down the sleeve here to make sure that the jaw pads are straight. It looks like it wants to be right about there. Okay, I'll tack these two together. So let's test it. Here's the tack welded piece. So I'm just going to take this piece of wood and I'm going to close the jaws. And I'm just very lightly clamping, just using the thumb screw to apply pressure. Because I don't want to break the tack welds apart. But as you can see, it's holding. Granted, very, very light pressure. But the concept's working. So now I'm going to finish weld everything. There it is, all welded up. It's still warm. My heat feels good on my old bones. So I'm gonna let this cool off, and I'm gonna grind some of these welds. I'll touch some of them up, and then we'll do a little sculpting on the sleeve. There it is, all ground and sanded and nice and smooth. I wire brushed the welds, but ground off a few, wire brushed a few. Let's put it together. To prevent the movable jaw from sliding off, I'm gonna add a little set screw right there. To finish all this ground metal, I'm just going to wipe on a coat of linseed oil. Well, it's test time. So here it is all assembled. Set screws in, movable jaws on. Let's clamp these two pieces of junk together, whatever they are. There you go. Holds tight. It ain't going no place. And you can one-hand it. Since this stays oriented and stays locked into the threads, you can one-hand it. With that, I'm gonna call this one good. Got a nice usable rugged tool out of this. So she's going into service and it's on to the next project. I'll see you there and then.